Welcome back to Fat Bustin' Cookin'. Today is just Mrs. Tiny and we're doing some baking. So we're going to bake some pumpkin pies today. So we're going to start with the crusts. So the first ingredient is butter. I am going to slice the butter thinly to make it easier to mix up. And it is cold butter at this point. Okay, so here's the butter all sliced up. I'm making 4 crusts today. I'm going to do it all at the same time and see how that works out. Hopefully it turns out. Okay, so I have put my butter in the freezer while I do the rest just to keep it chilled. And I'm going to start with the coconut flour. So we will put 3/4 cups of coconut flour per pie crust. Okay, so I have 4 times the 3/4 cups of coconut flour in here. I'm going to add a tablespoon per pie crust, so 4 tablespoons of icing sugar. I like the Truvia icing sugar. If you don't have icing sugar, you could always make it with I use a coffee grinder and I grind up the regular monk fruit or erythritol sugar, and then just measure accordingly. Okay, that's in the mix master. Now we're going to add a 1/2 teaspoon of salt per. Now with salt, I don't usually measure perfectly. It's really up to you how much you put in. Sometimes I put in more or less and it usually turns out fine. It's all in your preference. Okay, so I have added that. And remember, it is always best on keto to use either pink Himalayan salt or just regular sea salt. Please don't use table salt. That's so bad for you. Next, we're going to add some Xanathin gum. I use this brand this time. It doesn't matter what brand you use. I get this from Sobeys though, or Save on Foods, or pretty much any grocery store now. Okay, I've added 1 teaspoon per pie crust. Now for a little extra kick, I like to add a little bit of allspice. You don't need to, but it just gives that dough a little bit of an extra kick. And do that to your preference, to your taste, so you don't have to do a whole lot. Okay, now we're going to mix this up. Okay, so that's all mixed. So I grabbed my butter out of the freezer, and it's about a 1/2 cup of butter per crust. So I'm going to put in 2 cups of butter. With that, I want to mix it until it's lumpy, not smooth. Okay, so now we've got our lumpy pie crust without the liquids in it. Now we're going to add egg whites. So I've got eggs here. I'm going to use 8 of them, but you only need 2 if you're making a single batch. Okay, so our egg whites are added. That took a little bit of time because getting it through this egg white separator is a little bit difficult, but I did it with one hand as well. So now I'm going to add a 1/4 cup of cold water per pie crust. So I'm going to add a cup of water. Once your cup of water is added, you can add a 1/2 teaspoon of vinegar. You can use either white or apple cider vinegar. If you want that little bit of a kick from the apple cider, go ahead. I'm just going to use white today. And that's 1/2 teaspoon per pie. Okay, now we're going to mix this all together until it forms a dough. Okay, so this is it all mixed up. I'm going to grab some Ziploc bags, split it into 4, and kind of smooth it out a little bit, and then I'm going to put it in the fridge for about an hour. Okay, so I've got our 4 pie crusts in bags, and they're about to go in the fridge. Okay, our crust has been in the fridge for about an hour, so I'm going to roll it out now with my rolling pin. I find the easiest way to do this is with some parchment paper, and then we're gonna roll it out big enough for my pie plate. I'm just using some tin pie plates because I'm gonna freeze them and then I won't be using up my glass dishes. Okay, so I have got this big enough that it'll fit in my pie pan, and I've got it quite thin, but not too thin. So now I'm going to put you down here. and show you a really cool way of doing this. So the reason I like to use parchment paper is because once it's done, I can do this, hold that on, and like this, and then press it in my pan. Once it's in my pan, I can get the parchment paper off, nice and slow. Just make sure it stayed pressed in, and then I can cut around my edges. Okay, I've got that in my pan, and look how great that looks. And you can still see the flecks of butter, but of course that'll melt in the oven when we bake it. So I'm going to make it look a little fancier just by adding some fork marks around the side. Like that, just like so. Okay, and look at that. We have a pie crust. So now I'm going to make the filling. And that is a fairly easy task. And I actually pureed my own pumpkins. However, you can buy real pureed pumpkin in a can at the grocery store, and there's no shame in that. That's what I did at Christmas or at Thanksgiving time. Okay, now the filling. So the first step is 3/4 cups of heavy cream. I use 36%. You can use 33% if you absolutely need to, but 36% has the least amount of carbs. I'm going to put in 3/4 cup per pie, and I ended up having 5 pies out of that batter that I made. So I'm going to do this times 5. Okay, so that is our cream. Now I'm going to do 15 eggs because it's 3 eggs per pie. Okay, so the eggs are mixing in with the cream, and I'm going to now add 2/3 cup per pie of icing sugar. Okay, so that is mixing together. I'm just going to turn it up just to get rid of those clumps of sugar. I use icing sugar because then you don't get that grainy feeling when you're eating the pies after if it doesn't cook enough to melt the sugar, because erythritol and monk fruit melt at a different rate than normal sugar does. Alright, so it's looking like my mix master is not going to be big enough because I need to put 2 cups of puree per pie into it. So I'm going to put the puree in a metal bowl, and then I'm going to mix the mixture of that in, but I'm going to put the spices in to the mixing bowl before I add it all together. So spices, I'm going to do 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, a 1/2 teaspoon of ground ginger, a 1/2 teaspoon of ground nutmeg, and a 1/4 teaspoon of allspice, and a 1/4 teaspoon of sea salt, all for 1 single pie. So I'm going to times that by 5, and then I'll also add the teaspoon or a little bit extra of vanilla extract, and then I'm going to put in about a 1/2 teaspoon per pie of xanthan gum just to make it a little bit thicker, because the last time I made it I didn't do that xanthan gum and it wasn't quite thick enough in my books, so I'm going to do that just to thicken it up a little bit as well. Okay, so I've got 10 cups of puree, and I've got my mixture. So I have added everything that I already told you I'm going to add. It's a little bit clumpy because that's what the xanthan gum does, but that'll go away when we cook it. So I'm going to mix the two together and then mix it all up. Okay, so we've got our pumpkin pie filling, and it tastes just like pumpkin pie. And I've got my 5 pie crusts ready to go, so I'm just going to put some pumpkin pie filling into the pie crust and fill it up. Okay, so that is 1 pie filled up, and as you can see, it's pretty good filled. Next step is to bake them. My pies are ready to go in the oven. I am going to I preheated the oven to 450, and I'll be leaving them in the oven at 450 for about 15 to 17 minutes, and then I will be turning it down and to 350 and baking for another 35 to 37 minutes. I am going to do 1 in the air fryer and 4 in the oven just to see if there's a bit of a difference with the air fryer. I've never done a pie in the air fryer before, but I'm going to try it. Okay, so this is the final result. I made a few, these three, without putting any tin foil around the edges. You can also use a pie guard. I made these two with the tin foil around the edges, and a couple pieces fell off. It's got to be easier with a pie guard, but that's okay. They still turned out looking amazing. So now I let them cool it up, and then I will freeze these because I do not need to eat 5 pies. So thank you for watching Fat Busting Cooking with Mrs. Tiny.